Cyberpunk is a hot genre right now, and you'll get no complaints from me about that. It's been a personal favorite of mine for most of my life. But with Cyberpunk 2077 on the horizon, we've seen a surge of games and other media trying to appeal to the dark future-loving demographic. And though I don't think it's fair to accuse all of them of simply trying to cash in on the hype wave, there have definitely been some. And I'll be honest, when I first loaded it up, I thought Cloudpunk was going to be one of those games. It had good reviews though, so I decided to try it out when I needed a break after an intense season of covering Cyberpunk 2077. Perhaps it was something that could scratch that Cyberpunk itch while waiting for 2077. But on the other hand, driving a hover car around a futuristic metropolis making deliveries sounded like the paper-thin premise of a cheap mobile game that you play on a bus ride home from work, not something that appeals to an action-adventure open-world RPG-loving gamer like myself. So I thought I'd end up refunding it well before the 2-hour limit, but I didn't. And it wasn't. I was completely wrong. This game was a delight. And when I finally hit the ending at the 12-hour mark, I felt like I had just turned over the last page of a good book. The kind you read on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea. There was no blanket, but I did have a cup of tea with me most of the time while I was playing Cloudpunk. It's just that kind of a game. And I was both satisfied and disappointed when it was over. So no, it's not a rip-off or a cash grab, it's a solid Cyberpunk title, sharing thematic elements with the likes of Deus Ex and System Shock. The gameplay, however, is very different. It's not an action game or an RPG. There's no combat or any real way to game over other than completing the game. It's got side quests, minor resource management and item collection, and of course, driving. But what it really is at its core is an atmospheric, open-world visual novel. The story is the reason to play this game, or should I say, the stories, plural, of the main character and the many other side characters that not only have intriguing histories and subplots of their own, but serve to build out a rich and complex world full of history and dark secrets. The world itself is beautiful. Built with voxel art, this neon-lit city seems to go on forever. Most of the time, there's no ground beneath you, just clouds above, clouds below, unending rain, and nothing but skyscrapers and glowing advertisements as far as the eye can see. Advertisements and public service announcements blast from unseen loudspeakers, making sure you never forget that the corporations are in control, and that CorpSec is always watching. The design of the city is very cohesive, and yet it's also varied enough to be believable and interesting. Different parts of the city have varying degrees of wealth and different cultural influences, and this is reflected in the architecture. Plus, there are a few very unique areas to visit as you progress through the story, areas that deviate heavily from the rest of the city, and I don't want to describe them here because I don't want to spoil anything. Suffice it to say, I didn't get bored driving around the city, especially when my travels were accompanied by the game's haunting synthwave soundtrack. The driving mechanics are pretty good in my opinion, especially after you've upgraded your hover car with a few improvements to mobility and speed. There aren't a ton of options for upgrades and customization. I would have liked a few more, but as far as the driving itself, it does take some getting used to, but I do feel like the devs struck a decent balance between accessibility and skill. I found the default controls to be very awkward, but it was easy enough to customize them. And I think what I love most about the driving is that you can fly literally anywhere. You don't have to stick to the roads. The main freeways give you a speed boost, but they're not always the fastest or most interesting way to get around. You can find shortcuts, fly above buildings and below bridges, or just take the scenic route to admire the city. Usually you're not really in a hurry to get anywhere, although there are some exceptions. There are a handful of timed missions that can affect the story depending on whether or not you make it within the allotted time limit or not. When you're on foot, you're more restricted, and there's sometimes a bit of a puzzling element as you figure out how to get from the designated parking area to your delivery destination or some other place you're trying to get to. Occasionally it got a bit frustrating, but I was pleased with the fact that there were no copy-pasted layouts as far as I could tell. Each area where you disembark your car seemed uniquely designed, with a good mix of common and unique assets. There's a lot of interesting things to look at, and looking around the city from the perimeter walkways on various skyscrapers definitely gives you a different perspective than when you're flying in your car. While on foot, you can find collectible items, buy and sell stuff at vendors, and talk to certain characters on the street. All of these are clearly marked on your map and your mini-map, which cuts out the need for unnecessary exploring to make sure you haven't missed anything, which for this game I think works really well. Most of the collectible items you find strewn about are just junk, and they're only good for selling, though occasionally they're needed for quests or to repair broken elevators around the city. At first I thought I'd be able to use the stuff I found to upgrade my hover car, but that turned out not to be the case. I was actually a little disappointed by that. And eventually I didn't really see the point of going out of my way for these random items. However, there's one type of collectible that's tied to one of the most interesting side plots of the game. I would eagerly fetch these to progress that story. Sometimes it felt like they'd been placed unnecessarily far out of the way, but most were within easy reach as I went about the main storyline. The interactable NPCs were by far the most interesting though. Whenever I saw one of those head icons on my map indicating that there was a person that I could speak to, I typically dropped whatever I was doing and headed in that direction. Some of these NPCs gave side quests, but it was the stories I was really interested in. They'd reveal snippets about the city or their personal histories, things that revealed a bit more about the beautiful, yet terrible world that they lived in. And this brings me to another reason I love this game so much. It employs one of my favorite types of storytelling, which is a type of storytelling where nothing is directly explained, but you're left to piece together the history and lore of the world and the characters as snippets and shadows of it are revealed to you by the main plot. In this case, you take on the character of Rania, a young woman from outside Nivalis, the city where the game takes place. She's completely out of her element, broke, alone, and working her first shift for the shady delivery company, Cloudpunk. The entire game takes place during this one all-night shift. It's a pretty simple plot at first, but things get interesting fairly quickly as the game starts to reveal things bit by bit. Things about Rania and why she came to the city, things about the city itself and its long, mysterious history, things about CorpSec, the authoritarian security corporation that controls Nivalis, and things about Cloudpunk and the mysterious control officer who gives you your jobs. These things are revealed hesitantly, often subtly, never giving you the full picture but giving you hints that something bigger is happening behind the scenes just out of sight. This is what kept me playing. I had to know what was going on with this city and the strange events that the characters were talking about. There are also choices to be made. Now, outside of altered dialogue, these decisions don't really affect the game or the plot. You always end up at the same place regardless, but some of the moral quandaries this game faces you with are truly thought-provoking, and it never gives you the courtesy of telling you whether or not you made the right decision. Sometimes different characters want you to do different things, and they'll make good points on both sides, and sometimes Rania herself will be conflicted to the point of frustration, or agonize after the fact, wondering if she did the right thing, all while trying to pick up and carry on with her shift so she doesn't get fired. This is where the cyberpunk genre shines, in my opinion, the shades of gray, the moral complexities that deny us the simple answers we crave. It's a reflection of real life that, to me, seems lost on a lot of people these days. People who just want to shout at each other on Twitter, people who have no regard for listening or understanding, and give no regard to nuance. But I digress. Cloudpunk also has a lot of simple, slice-of-life moments that keep the story down to earth, like Rania needing a cup of coffee to get through the night, or trying to find something good to listen to on pirate radio, and then discussing the music styles with the AI companion loaded into her car's computer, which, by the way, is the most delightful character in the game, and I'm not going to say any more about it because I don't want to spoil anything. Okay, I've spent a lot of time here talking up Cloudpunk's good points, and there are a lot of them. Of course, it's not a perfect game, and as I always do, I'm adjusting my criteria to account for the fact that this is an indie title with some obvious budget limitations, which I'm personally willing to overlook, but at the same time, it's only fair to give you as balanced a perspective as possible, and so I should note that sometimes these limitations do rear their heads in immersion-breaking ways, and one of the biggest of these is the reflections. Reflections are a massive part of the game's visual appeal. This game would just not be what it is if they weren't there. The city would look super flat and dead without those vivid neon reflections. However, they're not always accurate. There are many instances where reflective buildings or puddles of water are showing you something completely different than what actually exists in the game world. Most of the time, it's not very obvious that this is happening, but there definitely are times when the sharp neon lighting makes it very obvious, and when that happens, it's annoying. It pulls me out of the story and reminds me that I'm playing a video game that can have technical flaws. The developers have been continuing to upgrade and improve the game post-launch, and I hope that this is one area that they decide to tackle. And as a tangential note to that one, I think this game would be amazing with a ray traced lighting. Too bad that's not one of the options currently, but if they ever implemented that at some point in the future, that would be fantastic. It's also fair to point out that some of Cloudpunk's voice acting isn't great. Now thankfully all of the main characters sound pretty good. There was never a case where one of the primary characters was talking and I was like, oh please stop, shut up. Now that did happen with a couple of the side characters, but thankfully they did not have much screen time. And I think some of them were actually supposed to be really annoying, so there's that too. Another thing that was painfully obvious was that there are only a couple varieties of generic merchants and vendors, so you encounter sellers with the same appearance and dialogue in completely different parts of the city. I suppose you could headcanon it such that they're all clones or identical androids or something, but obviously that's not the case, and I'll just chalk that one up to obviously the result of some budget limitations. All of the flaws I've listed so far are things I'm willing to forgive from a smaller studio like Ion Lands, much like I've forgiven games like Greedfall and other ambitious, low-budget games for similar issues. When I look at an indie title like this, what matters most to me is that they get the core stuff right. Things like good story, solid gameplay, immersive atmosphere, and a fun experience. Indie devs are doing a lot to drive the industry forward, to drive creativity and variety in the games that are available for us to play. So I don't particularly like ragging on them for not quite getting the technical stuff right. It's a case of I'm sure they would have done that if they had had the ability to. The only thing related to the core of the game that I can really find to criticize is that I think they should have better fleshed out the lore behind the Cloudpunk delivery service and its relationship to CorpSec. After 12 hours in the game, I'm still confused about Cloudpunk's legal status. They're always trying to stay under CorpSec's radar, and some of the jobs are pretty shady, but at the same time, their name is plastered right on the side of their pickup warehouse, and at one point, Control mentions that they're only licensed to have a certain number of cars in one area, which implies that they are legally regulated to some degree. It's possible I just missed some crucial info somewhere, but early on I got the impression that Cloudpunk was an illegal operation, and then that seemed to change without explanation. Haven't found an answer for it online. If anyone knows, feel free to drop a comment below. All of that aside, I loved playing Cloudpunk. It's a game obviously crafted with a lot of care and attention to detail, and it's made me interested in checking out Ion Land's other game, Phoning Home. But this brings me back to the question in the title of this video. Can Cloudpunk scratch that Cyberpunk itch? In my opinion, yes, as long as you're looking for the right things from it. It's not an RPG or an action game. It's a visual novel with an open world. It's the story of a young woman trying to survive in a strange, harsh city where she's just a small cog in a very big and broken machine. It's the story of the people she encounters, the people her choices affect, and a city that feels alive, even as it struggles to stay that way. It's an atmospheric, story-driven experience set in a cyberpunk world. If that appeals to you, then you should definitely check this one out. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, sub, and hit that notification bell, and then check out some of these other videos. Find the link to our Discord server and other important stuff in the description below.